America 360 on NewsX World. Let's take a look at the top headlines coming out of the region this hour. Dick Cheney, who served under President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009, has died at age 84 from complications with pneumonia and heart disease. His family praised him as a great man and who lived a life of courage, honor and love. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy urges the US to supply long-range weapons and back Kiev's EU bid. He also calls for tougher sanctions on Russia as the Ukraine war continues. Zelenskyy says a new European Commission report shows Kiev is confidently moving towards EU membership. He urged Brussels to open negotiations on the first three clusters and remove artificial obstacles to unity. South Korea's spy agency says a summit between Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump is highly possible, likely after joint US-South Korea drills in March. The NIS believes Kim is ready for dialogue once conditions are met. Voters in Virginia and New Jersey head to the polls to elect new governors, a key test of public mood towards President Trump's first year in office. Early turnout is high, with both races highly contested. Canada's tightened limits on international study permits are impacting Indian applicants more than any other group. Ottawa has reduced student visas for a second year to curb temporary migration and crack down on fraud. Voters in New York are casting ballots in a high-stakes three-way mayoral contest. Democrat Zohran Mamdani leads over Independent Andrew Cuomo and Republican Curtis Sliwa, campaigning on free childcare, rent freezes and transit reforms. Hamas says its fighters have found the body of an Israeli soldier in Gaza and are preparing to hand it over to Israel. The announcement comes amid ongoing efforts to maintain the fragile ceasefire. Now our top story coming out of the United States this hour. Former US Vice President Dick Cheney, who is one of the most powerful and polarizing figures in modern American politics, has died at the age of 84. According to a statement from his family, Cheney has passed away due to complications of pneumonia and cardiac and vascular disease, surrounded by his wife Lynn and daughters Liz and Mary. Cheney has served as vice president under George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009 and was a chief architect of the quote-unquote war on terror following the September the 11th attacks. He had played a central role in the Iraq War, later criticized for relying on faulty intelligence about weapons of mass destruction. A former defense secretary, congressman, and White House chief of staff, Cheney wielded immense influence in Washington, though his hardline policies drew widespread controversy. In later years, Cheney became a vocal critic of Donald Trump, calling him a coward and the greatest threat to the Republic, and even cast his final vote for Democrat Kamala Harris in 2024. Now we're joined by Ross Feingold. He is a political analyst and he joins us live from Taipei in Taiwan. Ross, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you as always. Of course, we've heard very kind words coming from Dick Cheney's family. However, in Washington, he was a hugely influential figure. In broad terms, how will Dick Cheney be remembered?
Certainly, the war on terror and the decision to invade Iraq at the time that the United States was already fighting a war against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan is going to be the primary thing that people remember about former Vice President Dick Cheney, notwithstanding his many, many decades in public service as a Secretary of Defense, as a member of Congress. But the most controversial and notable historical event that he was part of was the war in Iraq.
Another thing, of course, he was criticized for was his use of interrogation, etc., towards suspected terrorists in the likes which he approved in the likes of Guantanamo Bay. What more can you tell us about that, Ross?
Vice President Cheney was a proponent within the administration for aggressive forms of interrogation, and at the time the administration decided to proceed. Over time, more objections were raised. There was court cases about this. A lot of criticism from the subsequent administration of President Obama. So certainly it's something that people, looking back, they say maybe the United States shouldn't have done this, but we have to keep in mind the context. And frankly, there's no guarantee that a future administration wouldn't adapt the same tactics if the circumstances are similar. We have a president at the moment, President Trump, and makes no secret about his willingness to use aggressive tactics against suspects, for example, in the ongoing war on drugs. So certainly there was lots of criticism of those decisions, but again, a future administration might also use the same tactics.
Yes, and Ross, of course, Cheney, and of course his President Bush, they were in power during 9/11, of course. How would you analyze their dealing, Cheney's dealing of that situation?
To be fair to them, I think they did what any leaders would do. They did what they had to do. Most immediate was the rescue and recovery operation on site, and we saw cooperation between local, state, and federal employees. And then very quickly, the decision to go after these terrorist organizations, most notably Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, where they were hiding in Afghanistan and other places in the Middle East. So they did what they thought was necessary to keep the United States safe. And that was their primary responsibility above all, above any policy area, domestic foreign policy. The most important thing is to keep the American people safe. And President Bush and Vice President Cheney did what they thought was necessary.
And of course, Dick Cheney, he was a vocal critic of Donald Trump, saying that he even voted against him. How much does that show that the Republican Party has changed from this old hawk era of Republican to now Trumpism?
Certainly, President Trump's views on domestic and foreign policies are the driver of Republican Party positions, whether that's in the federal government, where President Trump is the boss, or within or among Republicans in Congress. So many of the views that Vice President Cheney would have had when he was in office in the first part of this century, those are just no longer the views, no longer the prevailing views of the Republican Party. The party has clearly migrated to positions that are more populist. The views on trade have changed significantly. And even the views on intervention overseas is currently changing as well, with more Republicans being very much against that. So the party has changed, led by President Trump. So it'll be very interesting in the coming hours and coming days to see what current Republican leaders say about Vice President Cheney.
Yes, Ross, do stay with us as we have further updates to discuss. But we have some more breaking news coming in, and former US President George Bush has paid tribute to his late Vice President Dick Cheney, who died at 84. In a statement, Bush described Cheney as among the finest public servants of his generation, praising his integrity, intelligence, and dedication to duty. Okay, we will of course bring you all the updates on that developing situation as we get them, of course. Now moving on, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has addressed a European Union summit where he issued statements regarding a plethora of issues impacting Ukraine. During the address, one point of his was he called on the United States to provide Ukraine with those long-range weapons it so desires. This comes as Russia has recently tested nuclear-powered cruise missiles named the Vestkhovik and the Poseidon underwater drones that are designed to carry nuclear warheads. Earlier, US President Donald Trump has halted the transfer of long-range weapons to Ukraine, especially the Tomahawks that Ukraine is seeking. He also called on Western countries to put more sanctions on Russia over gas and the nuclear sector. Meanwhile, President Zelenskyy has talked about the EU membership, possibility of EU membership, and he also said that President Trump supports Ukraine's bid for said membership, while highlighting that Ukraine needs full-fledged membership of the European Union to be treated as equal. He hoped that Ukraine would be in the EU by 2030. Earlier, an EU's enlargement report have hailed the reforms undertaken by the Ukrainian government during the war. Now joining us once again is Ross Feingold. Of course, Zelenskyy reiterating his desire there for these long-range weapons, particularly those Tomahawk missiles, which he is still sorting after, even after he was declined in that White House meeting just a few weeks ago with Donald Trump. Ross, what is holding Washington back here, particularly after Donald Trump has been particularly vocal of Vladimir Putin and Russia over the past few weeks?
President Trump has been critical of Putin on and off, really now for approximately 3 months, ever since this summer. President Trump doesn't uniformly say nice things about Putin, although he's often criticized. But President Trump clearly still has a preference for a negotiated settlement sooner rather than later. And President Trump clearly takes the view that providing Ukraine with weapons like the Tomahawk missiles, which could travel long distances and attack targets within Russia, President Trump clearly feels that that is not a way to achieve either a short-term ceasefire or some kind of long-term peace agreement. And no matter how many times Zelenskyy meets with Trump in person, or how many phone calls they have, or how many meetings that the NATO Secretary General has with President Trump, and they discuss Ukraine and arms for Ukraine, for the moment, President Trump still is inclined to seek a peaceful, negotiated settlement, and providing the Tomahawks just don't factor into reaching a peaceful settlement from President Trump's perspective.
Yes, indeed. And of course, Ross, he claims that President Trump also supports Ukraine's European Union membership bid. How credible is that statement, and what difference would European Union membership make to Ukraine during this conflict?
It's probably not critical to whether or not the EU eventually does invite Ukraine to join and when that might happen. President Trump is no fan of the European Union. Everybody knows that. It's not a secret. So it would be odd for President Trump to openly campaign in favor of Ukraine joining the European Union. I think President Trump is more likely to continue to pressure the European countries to provide aid to Ukraine if they want, and to buy weapons from the United States if they want to, and to on the ground as part of some kind of buffer force if Ukraine and Russia reach a ceasefire agreement that would include a multinational force. But the idea of President Trump saying that the EU is good and let Ukraine join this wonderful organization, given President Trump's past views on the European Union, that does seem odd. Now, as far as how important it is to Ukraine. Certainly, the government under Zelensky, and I think it's fair to say a majority of people in Ukraine, they want to be integrated with Europe. They see their long-term future as part of Europe, and most notably as part of the European Union, and also ideally part of NATO, but that seems very unlikely as long as President Trump is in office. So it's something that Ukraine wants very much, but let's be realistic. Even if Ukraine was to enter the European Union tomorrow, it's not going to change the facts on the ground as far as the amount of territory that Russia occupies and the difficulty of ejecting Russia from the approximately 20% of Ukraine that it occupies, the European Union not being a military treaty. So will it change the situation on the ground as far as the front line and how much territory Russia occupies? The answer to that is also no.
Yes, Ross Feingold, thank you very much for bringing your insight. It's always a pleasure to have you, of course, on these topics. We now move on, of course, staying in the United States, and US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said that President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping may see each other again at the upcoming G20 summit. He stated that the United States and China's bilateral relationship is in a good place. This statement comes after President Trump and President Xi Jinping held bilateral talks on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea, where the United States agreed to lower baseline tariffs on China by 10%, bringing them down to 47%. In return, the United States is seeking market access from China in certain sectors, especially agriculture. This year's G20 summit is hosted by South Africa in late November, and as both countries are members of the grouping, President Xi and President Trump may meet again in Johannesburg. Okay, now joining us is Peter Cardillo. He is the chief market economist at Spartan Capital Securities, and he joins us live from New York. Peter, thank you for joining us. Secretary Bessent says that US-China trade relations are quote-unquote in a good place. How accurate is that statement, given what we got out of that Trump-Xi meeting last week?
Well, I think it's somewhat accurate. You know, I'm not sure if it's 100% accurate, but obviously after Trump's visit with Xi, there seems to be some movement. Now, I think you have to really look at the whole picture. It was Secretary Benson, along with other members of the cabinet, who basically said that China would cave in a lot sooner than they expected. Obviously, that didn't happen. So there's a give and take movement that's going on. And I think that he's probably correct saying that he's in a sweet spot right now. And that's because of the fact that there has been some concessions made by China. But have they been fully made? Absolutely not. Does the trade war with China continue? I think so. Will it come to an end at one point? Of course. Again, I've said this before, I'll repeat it again. No man is an island when it comes to a trade war. Trade wars, no one wins a trade war. And so I think that, both parties eventually will make concessions, and there'll be agreements. And I think if we look at, and I think one of the reasons why Secretary Benson has said that is because if you look at the TikTok agreement, right, there was a lot of enthusiasm that it was going to be a signed deal and delivered, but that didn't actually happen. But will it happen? Of course. And I think that's one of the key that Xi holds as a ammunition against this trade war.
Yes, and Bessent said, of course, there's this huge Supreme Court decision coming up, Peter, on whether Donald Trump's tariffs are indeed legal. Bessent says that other authorities can be used depending on the Supreme Court's decision on tariffs. How might legal uncertainty affect US trade and investment flows?
Well, I don't know what the outcome of the Supreme Court decision is going to be, but judging from what I've heard and read, it seems that there's the consensus indicates that they'll probably leave it to the lower courts. In other words, I don't think they're going to make a decision. And let's not forget that what's in question here is parts of the tariffs, not all the tariffs. So I kind of think that might be their scapegoat and saying, well, we think the lower courts should handle this, and it'll just go on. And I don't. That's my personal feeling. And again, what I've read and what I heard, I think that that decision, that there won't be a flat-out decision saying no, you have to reverse it or you can continue. I think they'll keep everyone guessing.
Yes, Peter Cardello, do stay with us as we have further updates coming out of the United States coming up next. And the US government shutdown has entered its 35th day, tying the record for the longest in history. Congressional deadlock continues as Republicans and Democrats blame each other for the standoff. And now the shutdown has halted food assistance for more than 42 million Americans and left federal workers from law enforcement to the military unpaid. Senate votes on stopgap funding measures have repeatedly failed, with Democrats withholding support to secure healthcare subsidy extensions. Meanwhile, airport security screeners, unpaid during the shutdown, are in a stronger financial position than 2019. Pay and benefits for Transportation Security Administration employees have increased significantly, with average salaries rising to over $61,000, boosting retention and morale. Despite being unpaid for more than a month, TSA workers continue reporting for duty. Peter Cardello joins us once again. Peter, the government has entered its 35th day of shutdown, the tying for the longest in US history. How damaging is this prolonged standoff to America's overall economic outlook?
Well, I think it's damaging, but I don't think it's devastating just yet. Of course, if it would continue, obviously, it could be devastating. But, speaking about that, there seems to be movement over the past 2 days. It looks as though both sides are beginning to talk. In fact, the Democrats have asked President Trump to intervene. So I kind of suspect that we're at a point now where both parties are feeling the political heat and the consequences of it if this continues. And so I'm very confident that we are probably getting near a solution. Whether it happens by Friday, I'm not sure. But I think, over the weekend, we might see a breakthrough and possibly by the beginning of next week, a resolution to this shutdown.
And Peter, over 42 million Americans have lost access to food assistance programs. What does that scale of disruption say about the vulnerability of US social security nets during political deadlocks like this?
Yeah, I don't think it'll get to that point. When you talk about Social Security, both parties would suffer greatly if it got to that point. So I don't think that that's going to happen.
Yes, Peter Cardello, thank you very much for joining us here on NewsX World. It's always a pleasure to get your insight on these matters. Now we move on, and voters across 4 US states are casting ballots in key elections that will test public mood towards US President Donald Trump's first year in office. New Jersey and Virginia are electing new governors with both races expected to be close. Meanwhile, in New York City, self-proclaimed Democratic Socialist Zoran Mamdani faces former Governor Andrew Cuomo running as an independent and exposing the party's generational divide. Meanwhile, California voters are deciding whether to let Democrats redraw congressional maps in a move that could shift control of the US House. Former President Barack Obama has rallied Democrats as early turnout hits record levels across the states. And that is a wrap on America 360. Keep watching NewsX World for more international news updates.